All right. Thank you so much for joining me on the Hybrid Remote Center of Excellence. I'm Nola Simon. I'm your host. And with me today is a woman that I hired as my coach way back in 2016, Sarah Vermunt. Thank you for joining us, Sarah. Did I
Oh,
miss
I'm so happy to
anything in?
be here.
It's fun. I don't think we've actually seen each other even on a Zoom screen for almost 6, 7 years now.
It's been a long time.
It has. Sarah's a very big fan of googly eyes and nature pictures and art. You're part of my guilty secret in terms of following artists on Instagram as well.
Oh, there's no other, I don't even follow any of my friends on Instagram. It's all just like inspiration porn for me. Artists, nature folks, photographers, that's what I love.
Exactly. That's right. I hired Sarah when I was stuck in a job that I'd been in for a very long time and I was having trouble pivoting. And I really needed somebody to sit with me and help me become clear on what my options were. And she was a big inspiration in lots of ways. In a lot of ways, the work that we did together really paved the foundation for a lot of the things that I'm doing right now. And that's why I wanted to invite Sarah on to talk about this. So first thing we wanted to talk about is why I hired you in the first place. And that is this story. I look for coaches who are willing to tell their stories of how they failed and pivoted themselves because life isn't perfect. Life isn't Instagram. Do you want to tell the story about how you started your coaching business and how you got into that? Because that is the story that meant that I hired you as my coach.
Yeah, and that's cool for me to know that this story is why you ended up connecting with me, Nola. Okay, let me share this story with you. I'm a career coach, and specifically, I'm a career change coach. I have a company called Careergasm, and I've been doing that for 10 years. But before this, I was a professor at a business school. And that is a profession that is fairly prestigious. I worked pretty darn hard to get there. And I didn't love it. I loved teaching, but I hated conducting research. And naturally, I did what most people do when they realize they don't love their job. I tried to push it down. I tried to ignore it. I tried to power through. I tried to just stay on the path that I worked very hard to get to. Fast forward a couple of years into that career, I was having all sorts of issues. My mental health wasn't good. My physical health wasn't great. I had unexplained hives on a regular basis. I had all sorts of gut problems. Things were getting bad. And it was because I was really out of alignment with my work. But one day I was working at a Starbucks. I had a nice little latte beside me. I was working on my research. And on that day, something just broke. I don't know if the last grain of sand in that hourglass timer finally dropped or what happened, but all of a sudden, really what happened is I had a mental and emotional breakdown in a very public place. I started crying uncontrollably. Truthfully, Nola, what it felt like I was outside of my body, hovering above my body, watching the whole drama unfold. I had just had too much of work that was not right for me. And I had tried to push through for too long. And I finally had a breakdown. I nearly spilled my little latte all over my computer. People were staring at me. I had to leave to try to compose myself. It was not a good scene, but it was exactly what I needed because I gave notice the next day. Like it was that much of a line in the sand moment for me. It's interesting when I share that story, I often tell people that it happened all of a sudden, but it was also a long time coming. And both of those things are true. And it gives me a ton of empathy for the people I work with, because most of the people I work with are people who know that something feels wrong in their career, something doesn't feel right, but they don't know what that next thing is. They have all sorts of emotions about what's next and is it possible and all sorts of fear and doubt. And I know those feelings intimately because of that experience.
Yeah. And when I came to you, we had just been through settling my father-in-law's estate. And a lot of the reason that I had stayed in the position that I was in as long as I did was really because my husband was self-employed. We needed stability. And I was the stability and he was the flexibility. Right. For me, it was like I needed to maintain the stability. I wanted to pivot within my company, but I wanted something better. And it was like I felt stuck, I felt limited, and I felt like everybody wanted me to stay exactly where I was, and I didn't want to stay where exactly I was. right? The work that we did, for Sarah was our first introduction to co-working. She had a beautiful office in WeWork. I'd never been in a WeWork building before. And she used to give out like journals and stationery. And I probably even still have the pen that went with that. And what we would do is draw, and I'm not an artist at all. It's probably something that really took me out of my brain. And I remember that at one point you had me draw what it was that where I felt stuck and what it was that I didn't want anything more of. And the other thing that I remember about working with you too was also boundaries. I was working hybrid, and Sarah only had specific days where she was at the WeWork office, and I would actually have to add days where I was down in the office in order to go see you. Right. Because you were good at enforcing your own personal boundaries, because that was how you were running your business. But it was good for me as well, too, because it was like a distinct action that I had to take, and it was a commitment to that coaching.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's a little background of how we work. But I wanted to ask you about that intuition piece. What's the magic behind like drawing out what it is you want, what it is you don't want, and how does that work? Because I know you've done a lot of the mystical stuff, and I don't know that I was exposed to that, but I think you've developed the practice since we worked together, right?
What I usually have my clients do is approach the question, what do I want, from a bunch of weird, different little angles. And from experience, how there's something about that really helps you finally get unstuck. Because I think sometimes when we're really stuck, it's because we're approaching a very loaded question in a linear way. There's almost just like way too much pressure for the answer of that question to approach it from a linear way alone. What I typically do is I have my clients do all sorts of fun, kooky little exercises that help them identify what matters to them, what their values are, what their strengths are. Also, the crap that drives them crazy that they would love to not have in the next phase of their career. And we often have these like big jumbled lists that feel soupy at the beginning, but then over time, those lists crystallize into a couple of ideas that we can put on the table for things for people to explore, things that feel really kind of interesting, that people are curious about knowing more about. And something that's been really helpful for me in my work with clients, and you might remember this yourself, Nola, although it's been a while. What I often do with the folks I work for and with is we have one phase where it's like pure dreamy exploration clarity work, and we separate that completely from doing in decision making. And the reason why that is valuable is because very often we tend to jump to decision making and doing in our heads right away as we're trying to explore things. And what happens is it just forces you to shut everything down, because you can always think of the why nots and the what ifs and maybe this could go wrong, and then you feel like you don't even maybe want to investigate some of those things that you genuinely enjoy. That dreamy phase that you were talking about, identifying a future you want, a future you don't want, and really clearly articulating that, is a really valuable part of the process. I always tell my clients, clarity before strategy. That's something that runs through all of my work, whether I'm working with individuals or working with organizations.
Exactly. And honestly, that's a part of how I design my process as well for hybrid is, it's not much about the office and how many days or what that's going to look like. Is what do you want it to look like? If you were going to throw out the rule book, what does this look like? What's your dream? And honestly, I've incorporated that myself because I
know that's wonderful to hear. And for the kind of work you do around hybrid work and the future of work, I think very often people and organizations are asking the wrong questions. And I think the questions are really where the magic is. For example, right now, some of the questions people are throwing around are, how do we get people back to the office? And how do we figure out the scheduling for the days? And they're these very logistical questions. But I think what's much richer and more productive is when you scratch the surface of that question, you have to ask yourself, okay, why do we want people back in the office? Or are we assuming that we should have people back in the office? Is this really about collaboration? Or in some cases, it's about surveillance. It's about control. These are for people who maybe don't have such a great leadership team, or they haven't figured out how to properly measure productivity and output. I think the questions under the questions that people are asking are far more interested and far more productive. And the question why is always a good question to ask when you're just to dig a little bit deeper about the kind of things you're trying to implement in a workplace. Like, why are we really trying to do this? And why are we getting pushback? And is there maybe a different way for us to either enable or measure the kinds of things that are important as an organization?
Exactly. I just did a video series of 10 of the top questions people usually ask me. And the number one question is, how do we get people back to the office? And that's my red flag question, because if you're coming to me and that's the first question you ask me, I'm going to be like, I think we have to do some work on your intentions.
Well, that's fabulous. And really, if they're open to it, someone like you could be such a wonderful resource to help them open up their thinking around that. But there has to be open-mindedness there and buy-in on the leadership team. And I think there's a lot of dinosaur organizations out there who are just trying desperately, grasping after those, clinging by their fingernails to the status quo around the way offices and workplaces used to be.
There was an article that was in the Golden Mail last week, and it was about people having difficulty getting staff back to the office, in part because of what's happening with the GO train and the D, because those are getting cut. There's just not as many routes running because they just don't have ridership. And I was interviewed by CTV last year, and I told them that was going to happen because the cost of gas, all the costs are going to go up. It wasn't going to be reliable in terms of commuting the way we always did. And if people who always used to take the subway no longer take the subway, then they're going to drive, which is going to impact the experience of people who drive. I told them that a year ago. But what's interesting about that is, when I was reading that article, there was nothing about the intention about why they want people in the office to begin with. And it's like, it was just completely.
That's a huge piece.
It is. Now, media, I've learned so much from Sarah by the way that she runs her business. Now, media is a big thing because I remember when Sarah, she often does City Line now. You've done media all across Canada and internationally too. I remember when she was starting that journey, when media started coming to me last year about return to office and all of that stuff. Sarah is the reason that I felt brave enough to do it, because I'd seen her process in stepping up and doing that. And same with podcast guests. Before podcasts were really big, I remember Sarah putting out a call to people going, which podcast should I be on? Which ones are interesting? What do you enjoy? What really drives your interest in that? But you've said that the combination really between media and podcast has been like supercharged your career, right? And how you've grown your business.
For sure. I also really love it, but also it's been fabulous in terms of building credibility and exposure for my business. Back as I was just leaving academia, this is 10 years ago, my company Careergasm was just a little baby company. I was able to land a column with Forbes magazine. That was the first big media that I did. And I remember landing that gig and getting it and feeling like there was something there for me. I've always been a writer because I've written a couple of books. This was before I published my books, but I remember feeling like I had a lot to say. And also my voice was quite different than a lot of the people 10 years ago in the, let's say, corporate work world, a lot of other career coaches, because I'm quite edgy. I swear a lot. I don't drink the corporate Kool-Aid.
That was the other reason I hired you, and the name Careergasm. I remember something you wrote about how you actually settled on the name Careergasm.
Here's an interesting story, and I think this is maybe why my company appealed to a lot of media outlets too. I specifically chose that name because first of all, like, it really is essential to what I do. I'm really helping people create feel-good work. Let's play on words there, but also it's edgy enough that the wrong people self-select out. It's, you were talking about your red flag question. It's the same thing for me. It helps the wrong people self-select out because I love working with people who are a little bit edgy, a little bit open-minded, a little bit future-oriented. And I think that some of the places where I've had columns like Forbes and Inc. and Entrepreneur and interviews at Fast Company, all that stuff I was doing before television, for example, that's just old for me. I think because not only because of the content of the information I was sharing, but because of my voice and the energy I was bringing with it. I'm very warm, I'm very casual, and that just wasn't happening on those platforms a lot before. And then when I started doing a regular television gig at Cityline, it was just like another layer to that. And then eventually podcasts. And it's been really lovely to be able to share stories and advice with people who are genuinely struggling with something. And I think for anyone who's listening at home and struggling privately, those are the podcast guests I want to hear. Those are the articles I want to read. Someone who's keeping it real and trying to offer a bit of advice that's helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Because everybody's going through something somewhere in their lives, right? How do we filter through that and then set ourselves up for success in the future? And who do you want by your side through that process? You want somebody that you feel comfortable with, that you can trust, that you feel is approachable, right? If you've got a coach who's presenting themselves as all perfect, that's intimidating, right? I found you're really appealing. And that's why I've always wanted to stay in contact, because I think that the work you do is.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to ask you about my favorite thing that Sarah does, besides the googly eyes on the frogs, is when she does her nature walks, is the facial expressions that she makes on TV.
Oh my God. Let's talk about this. Oh my God. I didn't know you were going to go here, but I love you're going here.
Oh, but again, everybody's you see so much content. It's like, how do you display like executive presence? And I'm not interested in your executive presence. I'm interested in, do you have the confidence enough to go on to national TV and be yourself and spread helpful informational things, and then post all of your screenshots of be more pirate and all these different. Sarah's got the most expressive face out there, and she takes screenshots throughout her interviews and basically makes fun of herself and captions them, and it's just a lot of fun. It's like my favorite.
Okay, let me paint a picture of what Nola's trying to talk about here for anyone who like is maybe feeling a little bit lost. Here's the backstory on that, Nola. When I started doing this regular television show about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, at first, I was just going through and trying to find a good screenshot that I could post with the link that I was going to send. Let me tell you, it is real hard to get a good screenshot of yourself when you are speaking. You are going to look absolutely insane. Plus, on top of it, I am a very animated person. Like I just have very animated gestures and facial expressions. And as I was going through trying to find even just one good screenshot, I ended up taking a bunch of photos that looked like I looked like an ogre in one. I looked like a vampire in another one. I looked like, I don't know, someone who had just was shouting in another one. And I started posting something about once a month that I call little series I call Faces I Make on National Television. And it's just the most ridiculous stuff. And I don't know, I think it's fun to share that stuff because I think far too often we try to over glamorize our lives, right? Like with a highlight reel you see everywhere. So I was just having a bit of fun sharing the ridiculousness of the animated way I tend to show up on television. And you're right, people do love it because who posts pictures of themselves looking like a complete idiot?
And honestly, I know exactly what you mean, because like I do these little videos for myself. My whole camera roll is like clips of myself trying to look serious, and they're just like awful.
You might as well have a little fun.
Exactly. That's right. You're going to be doing the content anyway. Why not have fun with it?
We're far too serious far too often.
And that's honestly what people want to work with, right? Do you really want to work with the people who are just serious all the time? That's no fun.
It's also not real because nobody's serious all the time and everybody has those weird wonky moments. We just don't see much of it on social media.
And it also goes into building relationships, especially when you're not in person. The opportunities to really goof around and have fun and have little jokes, it's disappeared. Unless you're building that into your content, people aren't seeing that side of you. Right? So how do you show up in the world, right? And that's where I think that humor can actually be a bridge builder.
I'm glad you mentioned that because humor, I think, is a bridge builder in a lot of ways. Sure, it can help you feel more connected to someone, which is what we're talking here, and having a little giggle together. But also, like readers of my books will often say, oh, I wasn't expecting it to be fun and funny. Because very often, especially in my industry, in career coaching and career navigation, It's a stiff group. It's very serious. It's got a very like corporate masculine energy in a lot of ways. And I very intentionally wanted to build humor not only into my books, but you might remember, like even into some of the worksheets that I give my clients.
I was really glad you kept all the little cartoons.
Oh, absolutely. That was really important to me. Even like the images on my website are fun and playful. And I do that very intentionally, particularly for the exercises I give my clients and the workshops I do with my clients. I like to add a little bit of humor and a little bit of fun and a little bit of playfulness, specifically because it takes the pressure off. And it's very hard to get clear and get unstuck when you're serious all the time. Sometimes you just need to have a little giggle or look at something from a weird angle to help you finally get out of that rut a little bit and think differently. It's just one tool that I use to help people maybe like approach things with a different energy than they've been approaching them that has been keeping them stuck.
And has that gotten better or worse over the years? Like, how did the pandemic and working from home and like doing things differently, how did that change that aspect of it?
The humor aspect?
Did it change? Are people more funny or less funny, or is everybody craving
About,
fun?
about the same. I
Yeah,
think for me, it's always been a component of my work, and people have, at least my people, the people I
right.
attract, have always found it wildly refreshing because a lot of stuff they've tried before has felt very humdrum, very serious, very heavy. I don't think the pandemic has changed it for me. It's just been a consistent through line in my work and my people.
That's good. That's
Mhm.
good. You're attracting the right people. You're going to continue to have fun.
Yeah. One thing I'm really proud of in my work is the brand that I've built for myself because it attracts literally, let's say I have a day where I'm working with one-on-one clients. I will look at my calendar the night before, and literally every day this happens, Nola. It happened back when I was working with you too. I would look at my calendar the night before to see who I'm working with, and I'd be like, oh my God, it's all my favorite clients tomorrow. But like
That's right. I
literally,
remember you sending emails like that going, "Oh, you're on my list and I'm excited to see you."
literally every day I felt like every client was a favorite client, and I think that's because I've been able to build a brand for myself that is like really genuinely me, incorporates the elements or encourages the elements I want to see in my clients as well. It makes working with my people such a pleasure because I'm able to attract the kind of people I want to work with.
That's great. That's what every business owner wants, right? It's so much less work as if, like you said, people are self-selecting out and you're left with the people that you really want to work with.
It's a wonderful feeling.
Yeah, it's smart. It's smart. With everything that's changing in the world, because honestly, it's not that it's constant change anymore. It's just like change is always there. Last few months has been all of how is AI going to change everything. And for me, the exciting part about the AI is not necessarily what's existing right now. It's how everybody's talking about it, because it's almost like they're realizing that the future is a closer thing than they perceived it to be. How are you seeing that impact how people are showing up for coaching? Is that influencing your discussions?
It sure does. And the truth is, it always has, because no matter what period of time we're in, there's always something new on the horizon that people are panicking about or wondering about. And today it's AI. In the past couple of years, it's been like the work office culture, right? There's always something new and evolving, right? You're right in the middle of that. It's always been something that's been a part of my work. And I happen to think that agility and adaptability is the future, whether it's you as an individual employee or whether you're someone that's like a part of a leadership team in an organization. One word that often gets under my skin that a lot of people love, but is not for me, is the word future proof. And I just want to explain why I personally don't love that word. No shade to anyone who loves that word, but here's why I don't love it. The word future proof, I think, plays on people's fears about what they need to secure now and lock in now that they're safe in the future. Pursue this job because it's future proof, or this particular company is a future proof company. And I think it plays on people's fears and encourages people to lock in and be less adaptable. And that's just not the way the career world is anymore. In previous generations, people had more of what I would call a conveyor belt model of a career. It's like you went to school for a certain thing, you went through school, you came out the other end of that conveyor belt, And you mostly, not everybody, but you mostly stayed on that path for several decades. That's not how the work world is anymore. And most people have several careers throughout their lifetime. And I think sometimes with this whole concept of future proofing your career, for example, people can get caught up in fear about making the right or wrong choice about what they do in their career. In my opinion, it's much better to be agile instead of future proof. And I don't just mean agile in terms of like transferable skills and experience and ability, agile mentally and emotionally, like able to adapt to things and be open-minded about learning new things and what's next. I think that is a quality that employers want. Let me say, I think that's a quality good employers want and appreciate. And I think, in my opinion, what's more important is it's a good quality for us as individuals to have when we're thinking about making changes in our life. Sometimes I get questions from potential clients before they start working with me. They'll say something like, what if I choose the wrong thing? Let's say I'm talking to someone in their 30s or 40s, for example, like maybe someone who's been working for, I don't know, a decade. And they're like, oh my God, what if I choose the wrong thing? And I have to say with them, honestly, here's the thing. There is no guarantee that this next thing that you're going to choose is going to be the career path that you want to stay on forever. That's just the hard truth. Because you're making a change now, you don't want what you wanted 10 years ago. You 10 years from now might also want to make a change. Locking into a particular career path isn't necessarily the answer. And here's why. If you're a human on planet Earth, the whole point is to grow and change and evolve. And it's natural that your interests in life and work would change over time as well.
No, definitely. And you never know where things are going to lead you, right? Like when I got out of that job, I took the other job, and then that job was restructured 18 months later. I didn't expect that. What I realized was the most useful thing at that particular time, because we were into the pandemic, was the work that I'd always done to help people understand how to do hybrid remote. Because I'd worked a decade, some version of hybrid or remote, and all of a sudden there was everyone working that way. It was like all of this knowledge that I'd built up really as a way to facilitate the other work that I was doing had more value than any specific experience that I'd had in the work that I was like on the job descriptions.
That's interesting. And I think you're illustrating something here that's very true also for most of my clients. And that is, we have far more transferable experiences than we think we do. Like, we're talking like even someone who does a total 180, very drastic career change. Literally, I have never had a single client where we haven't been able to pull some threads from their past experience that's relevant to that new thing that they're going for. And that was your experience too.
And even just doing this, I did 2 decades worth of customer service. I never perceived that, but it's that's an excellent experience for being a podcast host.
Oh, it's excellent experience for having work relationships of any kind too.
Exactly. That's right. It's like, how do you reframe it? And what I also often find, especially with people who are actually up in making decisions about how the companies are going to operate hybrid remote, is they have a really difficult time undoing the world view and unlearning what made them successful isn't necessarily going to be what's going to make them successful in the future, and how their companies need to pivot, right? That unlearning, that ability, I think, is going to be important as well too, right? That
I think you're so right. You're so right. And you're right on two levels. Like, you're talking about it at an organizational level, right? Because that's the work you do. I definitely see that in the organizations I work with, but I also see it showing up in a really strong way, the need for unlearning in the people I work with, just the individuals I work with who are trying to make career changes, because all of us, like literally every single person listening to this podcast, has conditioning that they grew up with. They've had influences that impact how they think, their beliefs, their thought patterns, some of their habits. And it's interesting, unless we look at that stuff, that's just constantly running in the background, influencing our decision making, influencing how we behave in life, and the choices that we make. And until you start to notice what your conditioning is, and then actively choose which pieces are working for you and which pieces maybe aren't working for you, and
Yeah.
choosing which pieces you want to unlearn a little bit, it's very hard to move forward in a significant way. Unlearning is hugely important.
Yeah. And it's the stories that you tell yourself too. Like, how do you let those go during the pandemic? Like my neighbor, they have a cottage up north, they have the condo down in Florida, and they couldn't go. And she was very upset because the story in her head that she told herself was, I'm this person who flits around and you're interfering in my life. But it's funny because that's essentially happening in many different ways because people aren't necessarily going to be able to, like, if they're living longer, because generally a lot of people are going to be living until age 100. Have you done a financial plan that's going to allow you to retire at 65 and allow you to retire it or live until 100 and be able to afford that without working more? What story do you have to amend? And how do you reframe that for yourself and for everybody else in your life too? Because sometimes it's the story that your loved ones have about who you are and what you do that can be limiting as well too. I've found that.
That's true. And you've given a beautiful example there. And professional work career context, here's what I think, and I bet you're going to be on board with this. I think you and I are on the same track here. I think the future of professional development is personal development.
Yes. Yes. Talk
What
a lot about personalization.
the work that I do with people, you could say what I do is I offer personal development for people's careers. That's
Yep.
ultimately what I'm doing. And I think we're in an age now where more and more we are realizing that our internal stories, our emotions, our mental patterns have a massive impact on how we experience life. And if we can be more aware of and more intentional about how we can direct that for a real impact, I think a lot of people are going to be happier at work.
Oh, very much. And I think that's something that organizations really have to get on board with because you think about even how consumers really operate their own lives, right? Like you've got Netflix, you customize what you watch, you um, have like feeds and algorithms that you personalize and customize, right? Like people have had, when did the first iPhone come out? In 2006, 2007? We've had over 10 years worth of personalization. Why wouldn't we expand that and then apply that to our lives? That autonomy, the mastery and the purpose, that's intrinsic motivation, right? You're supercharging both your personal career and your organization if you empower that.
Absolutely. And when people are in alignment with that, they feel better. And that's only good for organizations.
Exactly. That's right. Job crafting is something that I did another podcast on with a specialist in that as well too. And that helps with workload too, because how is your job description, your daily task really tying into what the organization is trying to achieve? And if you can let go the extra tasks that have built up that really don't tie to performance anywhere, but people have gotten used to, it's a default. You let that all go, you're going to supercharge and customize the work and personalize it. And that's
I
going
think
to
I think that's too true. And I think job crafting is going to be a really interesting thing to keep an eye on in the future. Something else I think is going to be interesting to keep an eye on in terms of the future of work is how organizations measure output and productivity in a way that isn't just bums in seats and time on computer. It's incredible with the kind of advances we've made in the world, like in terms of like literally on every level. It is wild to me that organizations still rely, not all organizations, some places really have it together and are doing interesting things, but most, I would say, organizations to some degree are still reliant on like the time punch model of butts in seats, or the new version of that is computer software that monitors how often you're typing or whatever. Well, it's a really huge jump to assume that equals productivity equals output. There's a huge jump in logic there. And that is not my code to crack, but I will be fascinated to see what comes up in the following years around new ways for organizations to measure real output and real outcomes in organizations. And I struggle to even use the word productivity because
Yes.
productivity for long has been explicitly tied to time.
And one of the things that I drew in that chart when we worked together back in 2016 was about surveillance. I was always in customer service and my calls were always recorded, but they could also monitor, like I had to log into phones and log out. So they
Yeah.
knew when I showed up and they knew when I left. And they knew how long I'd been logged in and how many calls I actively took. And when technology started to change back then, they started being able to pick up like specific phone numbers, and I started getting interrogated about why I'd made specific calls to specific numbers. They could tell like which calls were internal and whatnot. And it became onerous because at that point I was what, 48? And it's when are you going to trust? It's more about trust. For me, it's a personal thing because it's like I escaped that and I won't work with an organization that monitors their employees like that because it fundamentally means that you do not trust. Now, there may be regulatory reasons, like my work was recorded for regulatory reasons, and that's
Sure.
fine. I understand that because certain things can end up in court. There needs to be a track record of that. But it's like, what else are you using that technology to do? And how are you guarding privacy, especially when you've got employees working at home too, right? Surveillance is a big thing that I think is going to become problematic. And we're going to see legislation in place worldwide start to be implemented to protect employees. Ontario implemented something, but they didn't build in an opt-out. I went after the Minister of Labor for that. I'm like, great, but you need this. And they haven't responded, but I tried.
Nola, I'm really glad you bring up this issue of trust because it is an issue that comes up with many of my clients. And it's often one of the primary reasons why people feel like they have to get out of their current career or job is because whether it's because of surveillance or because of micromanagement is all about a lack of trust, right? It's about control and trust. And feeling like you are trusted is really important to people, and organizations that rely on things like micromanagement and surveillance. There obviously isn't trust there, but what else is lacking there? And the reason they're relying on those old dinosaur models of impact measurement is because they don't have a good way they haven't been innovative and experimented with or created other ways to measure output and impact.
And
So
it's
yeah,
also reimagining the leadership and the management, right? It's more about how do we help those managers unlearn the way they've always done it and then move into something that's more coach-like and future focused, because it goes back to like how they do performance reviews and how they give feedback. It's usually retroactive instead of future forward. And that's where I think exciting changes could happen is, can we rejig the management and the learning within the organization to have it more future focused?
and that has to, people at the top have to be very invested in that.
Oh,
Going to happen. It's unfortunately something that can't happen bottom up as much as
no.
people wish it could.
And that's something that I've noticed is a lot of people are trying to influence from the middle, doing like keynotes and speeches and training and workshops. And companies are stepping up and they're doing a lot of that work. And it's good that they're doing that work, but unless they do that from the top down, in addition to that work, nothing's going to change.
There has to be buy-in for sure.
There definitely has to be buy-in, but there's a lot of latitude. I find
It's a polite way to put it. Absolutely.
and you see it like with the diversity work as well. And even like a network like Chief, for example, I think it's 80% of the memberships in the Chief network are purchased by organizations, right? Like they're sponsored, which is great, but are they sponsoring that because they're expecting change? Or are they sponsoring it because they want to whitewash and say that they've done something and nothing is going to change?
I would say in a lot of cases, you're right. It's probably the latter. And I think we're seeing that for right now, as we're recording this, there are a lot of layoffs happening in the big tech world.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've been following this in the news. If you crunch the numbers, many people's diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives have gone out the window as companies are downsizing. It really shows you which organizations are willing to put their money where their mouth is, because a year or 2 years ago, companies seemed very invested in changing things. And now we're seeing that was not necessarily the case, to a lot of people's non-surprise.
Was there anything that you wanted to leave people with that we should factor in here? And I'll make sure that we've got your Instagram and LinkedIn and your website. Anything else that we should have in here?
Perhaps the last thing I'll mention for folks is that it's really normal to feel lost and stuck at various points in your career. We're here talking about the future of work, but the future of work is always changing, and we as humans are always changing. And I just want to honor the fact that we are always changing as humans. And that means that sometimes we may need to make changes in the way we do our work, in the places we do our work, and even sometimes, as Nola and I have both experienced on our actual career paths, the fields that we work in. For anyone listening who is feeling like things are way out of alignment in their work, I have a free 3-day course that people can take. It's called the Careergasm Crash Course. And it's a course to help you figure out what some of those components that you would like to have in the next phase of your career. If you're feeling really lost and really stuck, that is an awesome place to start.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you making the time, and it's lovely to see you again.
It's lovely to see you too, Nola. This has been lovely.